It's the first two women talking of 2023. Happy New Year, Song. How you doing?
Happy New Year's, Liana. I admit I'm a bit angry.
Yeah, it is me, Tomboy Liana K. Kersner. God, I went back 10 years there. Liana Kersner and Girly Girl Song WXN talking about feminine rage and the divine feminine. And that was a bit of a Freudian slip because it's like, okay, we probably need to do a lot of definitions here. And you notice we're saying feminine, not female rage, because we're going to get into myth and theology and cosmology and all that stuff. And I am so sick of people making energy into body parts. Apologies to Greta Thunberg. So you recommended this topic, but I've just finished playing. I platinumed God of War Ragnarok. So the whole rage thing and how it's used and how anger is used in healing is a major focus in that game. So, I mean, let's start with the fairly modern but by fairly modern, I mean the last 100 years. Almost war on anger, that anger has become this bad thing. And this is something that isn't exclusively Western, or this is something we see in Eastern cultures as well, this marginalizing anger.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to bring up one of my favorite Robert E. Howard quotes again because it ties in, and it's civilized men are able to behave more poorly than barbarians because they know they can speak without having their skulls crushed in.
I totally agree with that. You know, I grew
And
up in a pretty rough neighborhood, and it wasn't civil, it was more respectful. Respect was currency where I
yes,
grew up. Yeah.
yeah. And so as we have become more civilized and we put more emphasis on, especially the Victorians. Oh my God, I hate the Victorian era and so much that came from it. And this idea that, oh, you suppress your emotions, a stiff upper lip, and all this. And it's like, as we have become more, oh, we're so much more civilized, we've had to fight and suppress these urges and these feelings because we don't know how to process them in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's become a war on it, and it just makes things worse, where sometimes you just kind of need to rage. And the problem with villainizing the emotion is you don't acknowledge that there is a healthy way to deal with it. And as such, it just makes things worse.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting metaphors in God of War is Atreus coming of age, teenage boys, metaphor, and learning how to channel his anger in a way that, doesn't, in his case, he turns into a bear and kills people because he got angry. That, individual results may vary there, but I agree with you. I mean, I think Victorian times were kind of a crock in terms of that. It was stiff upper lip in public, a whole bunch of shenanigans going on in private,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But unfortunately, that concept and I would go so far to say colonialism did spread this to an extent, this concept that anger always means you're out of control, and
Yes.
in the case of women that you're crazy. uh that's become a real issue, and before guys go but yes, male anger is vilified as dangerous. Not the same thing though, right?
Yeah.
It's not the same thing, and it's not that it's a better or worse problem to have, it's just a different problem. And one of the things that I have real issues with is this zero sum paradigm where we can only deal with one issue at a time. And so people are, they're invalidated and gaslit because the powers that be can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And anger is definitely one of those things that has been suppressed. I mean, we've seen it all through, I mean, God, the aggression with the video
Mm-hmm.
games thing, the confusion of aggression and violence, they're not the same thing, right? A
Yeah.
healthy amount of aggression is actually good for you, as long as you're in an industry and a workplace that um And I've got so many stories about that. Oh, geez. And, people are expecting game journalism stories. The worst example I had of this was in television, working at a youth music station. And this company, it was very, very toxic. And they used anybody getting rightfully angry as a way to brand them as unprofessional and even crazy. And this was a place where, you could get away with different things if you were different types of people, which is not right. But it was not uncommon to see, one of the senior producers curled up behind someone else's desk on the floor because he'd just broken up with his boyfriend. But oh Lord, if a woman got angry, there was hell to pay. It was that ridiculous. And does that mean anybody had it better? No, they just used different ways to minimize people. Right. And there was this one instance where we had a very, very successful series of shows. One of them was called Fromage, where we made fun of the cheesiest, not the worst, the cheesiest music videos. So it was a lot of Britney Spears and boy bands back in the day, right? Because they were just way over the top. And we actually got a thank you letter from the creators of the Hamster Dance for making it the cheesiest music video of that year. That gives you the sense of when this was going on in time, right? Yeah, you're gonna have that in your head forever now. One thing led to another, basically, and I had evidence of what I was saying and proof this supervising producer lied. And I printed out the emails to prove my version of events, right? That's what you do. That's how you prepare for something like this in the workplace. And I remember the guy sitting there with his nose in the air, refusing to look at the email. And I was like, just look at it. It's right there. And he just kept gaslighting. He kept going, no, 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 no. And of course, the Wicked Witch of senior management was sitting there grinning because she loved confrontation. But I said, just look at the email. It's right here. And nose in the air, he just looked at me. Try being a little professional. And I got up and I walked out. Because if I didn't walk out, I was going to slug the guy. Now, who do you think got in trouble and was disciplined for that exchange?
You.
Me. Not the guy who lied. The person who recognized she was angry, got up and walked away, which is what they teach you to do.
Because what else can you do?
You can't do anything. Well, you can explode, right? You can start screaming. And that was a place where there were a lot of screamers. There were women who broke down screaming in angry tears. There were men who, barricaded people in offices and screamed at them next to a copier. It was not a healthy environment. But the fact that doing the right thing and properly managing anger and walking out was actively punished. This is why I defend gaming. Because at least we're okay with aggression, right? Now, it's not that it's perfect, and games journalism was that really passive aggressive thing, except for Alex McCrease at The Escapist. I remember we were down at North Carolina Comic-Con, and I don't even remember what he said, but we were out for dinner after a day at a con, and every woman at the table started yelling at him. And he just sat there and kind of grinning like, what did I do? He could handle it. But other than that, it was this weird, you always got the sense that a lot of these editors and other reporters were just constantly sitting on a powder keg of rage, and so they could not handle passion in anybody else or believing strongly in something. And so whenever anybody got quote unquote emotional, which I personally think is good in that line of work, you want to care. But it was stifled because they just couldn't handle it. And of course, you see it leaking into op-eds all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And the fandom itself bears the brunt of it, but really it's not the fandom. The fandom's just too big. All types of people play games,
Yeah.
right? So are there some, you know, rageaholic dudes that are the stereotype out there? Sure.
Absolutely.
But if there was any causation or even correlation, there'd be a heck of a lot more of them. It Gamers are just people. You can't pigeonhole one group of people, but the people in and it was tech in general at this
Mhm.
time. That was the period of time where, and I'm gonna do a big swing here, zero tolerance policies in schools had enough time to produce, a crop of people who had been through that system, and
Mhm.
they never learned where to put their anger, frustration, and rage. And in comes me, who is the living embodiment of Kratos, right? And the interesting in God of War Ragnarok is they show an accurate angry wronged woman in Freya, and she's like almost shaking apart. That type of anger, this sort of stone-jawed, wild-eyed, um right on the edge constantly, that kind of anger, that's how they portray Freya. And it's tough to take, but it's so brilliant.
Yeah.
And
And
go ahead.
so I work customer service.
Okay, here we go.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I've already told you about this.
Yeah.
Last week I had a customer call me incompetent
Okay,
because I
that's the
was
short version. This story, guys, this story is bullshit, and the guy was in the wrong.
yes.
Um, first
um,
of all, you guys have drive-through banking down there, and that's not as much of a thing here.
we shouldn't have it.
Yeah,
Like
you have
I
drive-through everything. You have drive-through
yeah.
banking, you have drive-through pharmacies. And this guy was at a drive-through of some kind.
So he was in the drive-through, and then because I was the only teller, I work in banking. Hi. So because I was the only teller, I couldn't help him because I had to help people in the lobby. And eventually he gets impatient and storms in about how it's taking too long. And I did my best to explain, look, sir, there's only one of me. There's only so much I could do. He keeps storming around, and by the time the other teller comes out, he says, well, now I see why they need two of you, because one of you is incompetent.
Wait, so he was like pacing
Mm-hmm.
in the business. He was pacing in the building
All through it, because it's a pretty big space, and he was just going back and forth along the teller counter.
because things were being too slow, not because he
Yes.
was being told no, just it was taking a little while.
Yeah.
Okay, so he didn't like the fact that he was getting the attention of two people, so obviously we're taking this seriously.
Well, it was because I was the only one at the time.
Right.
And then the other teller comes back from lunch, and he's helping him, and he's being very polite and professional, and I'm on edge because I'm mad.
Yeah.
Just because it's like he's being so rude and so inconsiderate.
Well,
And
a
then
guy pacing like that, anybody with any empathy, you start feeling it too, right? You start feeling
yes.
agitated because this is not a understandable or predictable reaction. Like the level of emotion is not in keeping with what's going on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And like
yeah.
I don't handle confrontation well, so like I start shaking.
Right.
Like my hands are shaking as I'm doing a transaction.
Well, that's an adrenaline
And
response. I mean, that's your body getting ready to fight or flight, right? Like that's common. Everybody feels that. Some people are just better at channeling it than others.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then to be insulted to my face and be called incompetent, which admittedly it hit a sore spot for me. But I'm just like, what are you trying to accomplish? And I see it so much because I've worked a lot of customer service jobs,
Yeah.
and I see so much of it that just this berating and abusing of customer service workers who it's like they have no control, they have no power. If they're telling you they can't do something, it's because they can't do something.
Well, a
And
lot of the time in those systems too, the software will not let you. It's a security feature. in case,
Exactly.
in case, like, in case somebody robs the location, they have a limited amount of things that frontline people can do. That's a feature, not a bug. It's there for a reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even in other positions that weren't like that, it's people have I think we've learned that because we have this the customer's always right mentality.
Mm-hmm.
People have learned that if you go in and you throw a fit, eventually you'll get your way. And
Interesting. Okay.
I don't know if it's like that up in Canada or if it's strictly a US thing, but I see it even in like I see it online. I've seen it with customers in my life where it's like they just rage and it's like, well, I want a refund. And eventually the manager is like, sure, here's your refund.
It's funny because I've actually found when I'm dealing that epic odyssey of dealing with Adobe a while
Oh
back.
God, I forgot about that.
Yeah, I actually found that appealing to the customer service people's um I understand this is just your job. I'm not frustrated at you. I'm frustrated at the situation. I actually found that better, except for that one guy who asked me if there was a man in the house he could speak to. Um, yeah, that actually happened. But I do think there was this one guy I used to do charity work with, and he was like a man Karen.
Mhm.
I should just say Karen. Karen is a gender neutral term now. Apologies to people named Karen. There are so many names that are getting besmirched now. If you're a Karen, Trevor, or a Josh, life sucks for you right now, and I apologize. you know, but uh, it, you know, he used to brag that he could get free stuff by throwing a
Exactly.
fit, and it was so embarrassing that eventually I'm sure we're not the only people, but people stopped going places with him because we have this Yiddish term, a schnorrer, which is basically a cheap bastard, and nobody wanted to be around the schnorrer, right?
Oh.
Especially since he was also Jewish, and it's like, dude, this is a stereotype. Can you stop? Like, shanda for the goyim, you know? And it was really embarrassing, but I've heard from retail workers everywhere that it is awful. I didn't work retail for long. I worked at a jewelry counter for a while, and I worked in floral, which I don't know if there was a retail component to that, but I was also doing arrangement and packaging and cleaning and stuff like that. So it wasn't all retail.
Yeah.
But yeah, I heard from people. There was a tweet on Christmas Day about Christmas Eve where someone was saying that the after church crowd is the absolute cheapest, like difficult, and they don't tip. They just leave a Bible.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, can confirm.
And it's like, what? Like, what
Mhm.
what happened to, and this is where we get into tzedakah versus charity, and why that's significant in the way Judaism versus Christianity functions, because
Mhm.
tzedakah more accurately translates to duty or obligation. It's not charity, it's something you're supposed to do, and you can choose how you do it, but you're supposed to do it. It's a
Mhm.
the tzedakah, which is your obligation, and then there's the mitzvah or mitzvot, which is happy service. Basically, the belief is if someone's having a hard time, it is an opportunity for you to be of service, and therefore people go through bad times, and this is an opportunity to be more pious, more godlike, but it's got to be done through action,
Mhm.
right? You can't just pray for them. You actually have to do something. But charity has this feeling to it that you're doing a good thing. And it's we tie this into this. Where is this going? Judaism actually has sacred feminines in
Mhm.
ways that Christianity, well, non-Gnostic Christianity doesn't. right? And so it's this idea that women are just the vessel, and it's this complementarian ideology and all that stuff. And in Judaism, we've got women circumcising their own kids and stripping naked to foil plots. And,
Who was there's a Catholic story that's similar, but there's one in the Old Testament in
I
particular
think
in
it's
the book of
Deborah.
it's not Deborah. It's during Deborah's rule.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a woman who, I think it was a Hittite general, came into her tent and her husband away. So she gave him wine and then stabbed a tent stake through his head.
Yep. That's the way they rolled back then. I mean, the Bible, the Old Testament is a lot of hookers and blow.
It is.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, but
And I want to go back to the story of Boudica or Boudicca for a minute. So for those who don't know, Boudica was in Iceni. Basically, she was an Irish princess during the time of the Romans. And when her husband died, he divided his kingdom between their three daughters and Rome. And it was a peace offering, essentially saying, we acknowledge Rome's rule, just,
yeah,
you're at the head. But Rome came in and said, no,
yeah.
we're going to do what we want.
Yeah.
Beat Boudicca, forced her to watch as her daughters were violated by the Roman soldiers. And I saw a BBC History summarized video where they completely cut out her daughters.
Oh, yeah.
And they said, oh, no, she was supposed to inherit. And I also saw someone in the comments saying, oh, yeah, no, the Iceni were matriarchal, so it was hers by right, and it never should have been her husband's. And I'm like, where are you getting this bullshit?
Well, they're oversimplifying something that was not codified in the way we do now. Like it is sanitized, right? I got a book as a kid about Boudica versus Boudicca. If you wonder why there's two names, one is the Latinate version of the. She was a scene name. So all the stuff about her daughters were in it, but they didn't cover the rape in a kid's book. And so I revisited the story as an adult, and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah. For me, removing the daughters I hate that.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, especially since people are using it as this feminist story of what women can do. And for those who don't know, Boudica essentially led the most successful rebellion against Rome in that area.
Yeah, that does not mean it was successful, but it was the most successful. Yeah.
No, and the only reason it worked at all was because she had the element of surprise. And what it was she had a mother's rage, and she had her people who were all outraged at the fact that the Romans violated these 10-year-old girls, essentially, which is another reason why the argument of, oh, well, pedophilia and ephebophilia were totally common back then, and 12-year-old girls being involved with older men sexually was totally normal. No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
Otherwise, the Sen would not have been so furious at what happened to Boudica's daughters. It was still considered taboo. It was still an outrage. And so if you're trying to use historical accuracy to defend it, shut up and get out of here.
Yeah, they often, even when they did a sort of peace treaty marriage, it wasn't consummated until much, much later. This idea that, they were regularly having sex with 12-year-olds is just not accurate.
No, it's not.
And part of that was, the barbarian reputation that the Celts and the Essene and the Picts got was because, one of the things the Roman underestimated was the number of troops that they had, because they didn't factor in women driving chariots. And they didn't do that because they wanted to. They did that because they had to. Right. It was not seen as unfeminine. It was just, well, this is something you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's like, okay, everyone has to defend their home. Well, women in general don't have the same upper body strength that men do. So you find what you can do.
Yeah.
And that's what I hate about all these stories, where in order to be strong, a woman has to pick up a weapon and she has to fight like a soldier. Well, one, she's going to have to tremendously overcome a disadvantage because, again, she doesn't have that same upper body strength.
Yeah.
Two, why does a woman have to act like a man in order to be valid?
Well, why does everybody have to end up in that role to be valid, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I go back to Marcus Aurelius all the time, talk about, masculine energy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Aurelius actually had a co-ruler to handle the military elements in it because he was a scholar. He
Yeah.
wasn't raised to be an emperor or whatever he was. He was he knew how to run cities and he understood philosophy and he understood justice, but he was in the middle of like 2 wars and a massive plague at the time, and so he got somebody else to do the military campaigns. He had no head for it.
And for the people who are confused, no, Gladiator is not historically accurate at all.
No, it's not. But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is the Bible, at least the way, the Old Testament, Isaac is taught as a passive patriarch in Judaism. And I think in Christianity as well, this is consistent because Tolkien borrowed from it for Frodo Baggins. And, Isaac barely left the house. The interpretation is, he was scarred by his father trying to kill him as a child, how does that work? But he barely left the house and his servant had to find him a wife. And of course,
his mother sent the servant.
Yeah. And who she was chosen for her kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And Isaac is still considered a patriarch in Jewish tradition, but he's a different kind of patriarch. Like every patriarch and every matriarch in Judaism is different. We don't have this single masculine and feminine ideal that people are, supposed to embody. It's just not possible.
And, that's what I love about that we see in mythology and this idea of polytheism.
Yeah.
Is there are different gods to represent different things.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of growing and having a different one for each phase of your life. In fantasy, especially, there's the maiden, the mother, and the crone. I haven't really seen a male counterpart to that.
Well, it's the young warrior and the skull. It's the boy, like the coming of age thing, then the warrior, then the scholar.
Yeah.
But I mean, you get into African, like Yoruba tradition, and there's a different female deity for every body of water, and they're different age ranges and personalities and parts of life. It's very, very cool. And the reason it's the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine instead of the sacred male or the sacred female is because everybody in that tradition has a spiritual mother and a spiritual father. And part of the thing that the missionaries freaked out about was when they did ceremonies and, the god or the goddess was speaking through them, there was some gender nonconforming behavior. And that was Satan and had to be stomped out.
Of course.
Yeah. And I mean, that is not theological writing. You get into the actual writing and there's a lot of stuff about Sophia, the sacred feminine in, counterpart to Yahweh kind of thing. And Gnosticism and what Mary's role really was and all, the two Marys, what that all was. And it's much more nuanced than you get in the trickle down.
But can I just say this really quick? Because you mentioned the two Marys, and this is something that's always stuck with me. There is absolutely no evidence and no mention that Mary Magdalene was ever a prostitute.
No, never. That was added on.
She has become, somehow we got this idea that the woman Jesus saved from being stoned for adultery was Mary Magdalene. It's not. There is absolutely no indication. If anything, the text points to Mary Magdalene was actually a fairly wealthy woman.
Yeah.
And most likely she was the one who brought the alabaster perfume to wash his feet.
Yeah. Yeah, they really nuked Mary Magdalene
Yeah,
in,
and
over that 300 years where it
yeah,
it firmed up.
and Magdalene has become synonymous with prostitution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that makes me so mad.
And very abusive orphan laundries in, oh no, sorry, it's women unwed mothers in Ireland,
Mhm.
the Magdalene laundries. Yeah. Which I guess they were treated the same
Pretty much, yeah.
as prostitutes. But yeah, it's that's all stuff that we want to say religions, we like saying religion's the root of it, and I admit I've done shorthands and I've made jokes at bitter moments that way, but it's not. It's how religion, it's how the texts were woven into other systems that again have been this emphasis on false stability and suppression of emotion instead of feeling your feelings and processing your emotions, and taking that moment to go, I'm angry, I'm really angry now, I have a choice about what I'm going to do with that, so I'm just going to sit for a minute until I feel less angry, and then I'm going to act. And not, you can't always, I mean, in your situation where the guy was on you, you had to keep moving, which,
Yeah.
and for me, the
I
correct
did
thing is
glare at him,
glaring is
which he
good.
did,
I'm glad you glared at him.
which I did. He's like, yeah, she's standing over there giving me the eye, and I'm like, you insulted me to my face, you bastard.
We didn't even finish that story because wasn't he offered the ability to escalate it to a manager, and he was
Yes,
a total dick all over again?
yes. So what he said was, no, don't escalate it. I don't want people to be mad at each other all the time about everything.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm like,
Captain Self-Awareness, right? Like,
yeah,
and I mean, we had this whole conversation off air about whether this is a customer service thing, and whether you get this in other jobs. The truth is, guys like that are absolutely everywhere.
yeah,
And in, at least with a customer, they're there, they're gone, unless they're coming in all the time. But when it's other jobs and you got a guy like that, it's just, I worked at an ad agency for a while, and oh my God, the head of the company was a complete, I don't know what was going on, but he was fixated on the fact that I wear the gamer glasses. And he kept making these awkward comments in meetings with clients. So we're in with a meeting with like the HR department of a bank, and it's all these references to Call of Duty and things like that these women do not understand. And it was just so uncomfortable. And that's, I think there's a period in adolescence where, you just, perception is reality. All the feelings are happening. Everything's really overwhelming. Right. And one of two things happen. You either, well, three, I guess, you muddle through it yourself, figure out how to process those overwhelming feelings, or you have mentorship and guidance to teach you how to deal with those overwhelming feelings, or you get stuck in adolescence. And we see so many people stuck, and they're clearly angry, and they are so angry all the time that they can't admit they're angry.
oh yeah,
And those people, I mean, that's what I see with that customer story,
mm-hmm.
that he is just angry all the time. And it's funny because a mutual friend of of mine, and a buddy's, he Karened a waitress at a lunch once, about a month ago. And we were like, something is wrong. He's not okay. This isn't him. And, my friend actually sat him down and talked to him, found out what was going on. And that's what doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. We just so reject the more difficult emotions. We're such an avoidant society that nobody checks in and goes, what the fuck is going on with you, man? Like, this, either this isn't you or this isn't okay. Like, we don't treat, they say, watch how people treat waitresses, Uber drivers, support staff, retail workers.
Mm-hmm.
Watch how people treat them. because that tells you a lot about them.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is there's this stuntedness about culture that people don't, it's this am I the asshole thing. People don't want to say anything actively because of the way it'll get twisted. Sometimes I've been accused of being mean or being a bitch because I say, hey, we don't do that here. You don't talk to people that way. We don't do that here. And I'm like, why am I the bitch? Because I stood up and said, no, this behavior is inappropriate.
I think part of it is because there are so many people who abuse their authority
Yes.
that we've come to see anyone who displays any sign of authority
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
someone who is misusing it and someone
Well,
who is being a jerk.
and let's face it, the whole bitch thing, that's why it's such a problem, because
Well,
any
I was trying
woman
not to
making
say
a
it.
decision. Yeah, well, I use the word because that's what I'm called. I mean,
True.
I was on a stream. There's this one stream I delight in going on because the chat's kind of salty and spicy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always interesting to see what they lose their shit about and project all over the place. But within a half hour, this one stream starting, a guy called me an SJW lying bitch because we were talking about the Elon Musk plane thing. And I said that, they weren't reporting on the real time location of his family. They were reporting on the location of the plane. That's not the same thing. Now, of course, that story ended up being a total crock. The target of the stalker was Grimes, not Elon Musk. And it was a guy who was an Uber driver that filled up at a gas station close to her home. But I was the lying bitch, right? And I stopped and I was like, I said, it makes the other people very uncomfortable. The reactions of men when that happen, I find very interesting because they get very, very rattled, and I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate that they care. But, I said to this idiot chatter, like, it's not just that you don't talk to me that way. You don't talk to anybody that way. And of course,
Exactly.
it turned out that he'd been griefing this other regular, and the guy was ready to leave because this guy was just making him so miserable. But I think a lot of people don't feel emboldened to say, hey, not okay, because they may become emotional, and then we punish that. And that's not healthy. Like, you cannot go through life never being angry.
I want to bring this back to another point of part of why I wanted to talk about rage.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, so one of my favorite YouTubers posted a very long video, but in that she talked about particularly it's like the manosphere has this their definition of femininity seems to be sweet and compliant.
Yeah.
And any woman who isn't that isn't feminine. And like, hello, I'm the girly girl. I'm considering rebranding my personal pages to like roses and cream
Mm-hmm.
because feminine, sweet, soft, I like that. But I still have rage. And the idea that femininity has ever at any point in history been defined by sweetness and compliance. Like, sweetness, it can be there, definitely, but compliance?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I say trad isn't trad.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's not.
It's a pantomime of the myth of the 1950s. It's
Exactly.
not true complementarianism,
Yeah.
because in true complementarianism, the house is the woman's domain, and when the man comes in, he does what he's fucking told.
And you see that even with the Vikings, which is something a lot of these manosphere types love to invoke. And it's like, the woman could divorce the man if he abused her, right? The Vikings were, I don't want to say they were progressive, because like they weren't really, but in
Well, what
some
happens on the boat stays on the boat.
exactly.
Yeah.
There was also specifically with homosexuality, it was if you're on top, cool.
Yeah.
You're on the receiving end, you're not a man. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, here's
I mean, I think that everything about Viking, we've had this conversation on Twitch a lot. Everything about the Vikings was kind of ish.
yes.
And it wasn't so much a progressive society as it was a practical, adaptable one.
Yes.
So if they went somewhere and there was a different culture, they'd be like, okay, cool. You
They were
know?
also kind of like vultures, where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, what do you do well?
Yeah.
And what can we learn from it? But there's this story of the Vikings coming to North America and attacking a Native American village, and the men were running away, but this pregnant woman, not
Mm-hmm.
even pregnant, I think she was a new mother, she just grabbed a sword and was like, she scared them so much.
Yeah.
I think the story goes, she wet the sword on her breasts.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if you pay attention to any of these, I, I say this again, the idea that femininity is compliant at all. I'm sorry, the whole story of Pandora, where it's Pandora, don't do this. Okay, I'm going to do the thing.
Yeah. I mean, you see the myths evolve from we don't have a ton of the Anunnaki, right, in
Yeah.
terms of Sumeria, but you see that, and then even the stories, I mean, the Greek myth is very, social normy, where
Mm-hmm.
their female deities were more, I guess, it's active passive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you get into India, you get into the Hindu goddesses. I mean, you get Shiva, Kali, people like, they're badasses, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason that the hacker Linux is called Kali Linux, right? And then you get into, we don't know how much of the Welsh myth and the Norse myth are the same deities. Probably great many, like Woad is probably Odin.
Yes.
But then you get people like Bridget, and every goddess was some sort of fertility goddess, and then some sort of active force in the world as well. And
And,
go
and I
ahead.
mean, even to go back to the Greek, Athena was a goddess of war.
Yeah.
And Aphrodite, who it's like everyone's like, oh, so sweet, romantic. No, she was,
No.
in a way, the way they defined her, she was a goddess of madness because they regarded love and passion as a force of madness that made you
Right.
do stupid things. It blinded men to reason.
And because they like to nerf passion, then it became manipulation. And
Yes.
then we get the chaos is feminine. Apologies to Jordan Peterson fans. That was the point where I was like, no, this guy's full of shit in terms of cosmology. That yes, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, well, Christian tradition, femininity is the void, femininity is chaos. The light of the masculine has to come in and tame and structure and order the chaos, and so things can grow. But even Norse myth, the trickster is male. In
Mm-hmm.
Yoruba, Alegba, like Papa Legba, in Voodoo tradition, male. Chaos is not just female. You cannot say chaos is chaos, and chaos is a creative force.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that part of the reason we are so afraid of anger in this day and age is that anger makes you do shit, right? When someone just gets angry enough, they start taking action. And that's exactly what badly run companies and badly run governments and badly run families all don't want. They do not want that moment where fear leads to anger, anger leads to rage leads to chaos leads to get shit done. It's very, we look at the whole structure of this idea where, oh, you meet someone, marry them at I mean, the whole dating in your 30s thing, like, why? We live until 80 now, right? Like, when you're getting married in your late teens or 20s and you're only living to 40, dating in your 30s ain't so bad in terms of human lifespan. Like, chill, it's cool, right? There's
I
nothing
think
wrong with it.
part of the whole thing of marrying in your teens and early 20s, I don't think it's even just about lifespan. The idea was also it's keeping you out of trouble, because
Right.
that's when you do have those strong urges. So sanctify it, stick you with a partner so you have someone you
But
can.
that's it, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're well treated. It doesn't matter if someone's happy. It doesn't matter if you're fulfilled. Just stay there.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was a lot of this is going to be a bit problematic because it's all radical feminist writing in the second wave. And full disclosure, these are not nice people with a lot of bad ideas, but even, not nice people can say something profound. And Robin Morgan, who wrote Goodbye to All That, talked about this amulet of pain that every woman wears around her neck. And eventually there will be an offense so grievous that she will tear it from her own neck, even if it cuts the skin at the back. And, when I was in university and dealing with a bunch of shit, and then working in television and dealing with even worse shit, that was a rallying cry for me, that sometimes you do have to draw your own blood in order to pull off a shackle.
And honestly, I love that image.
Oh yeah, it's
I
beautiful
totally
writing.
relate to that.
Yeah, it's beautiful writing. And like I say, if you Google Robin Morgan, you're gonna see some pretty radical shit, right? And that's why I don't like the idea of just because a person who did some bad things said something right doesn't make that thing wrong. It just means they were right about that and wrong about everything else, right?
Yeah.
And I
Even
do,
a stopped clock.
yeah, I do think that there's way too much stay in your lane now. And I do see it go back, because when I was in school, kids still brawled. And I'm not saying it's right, but there were those fights at lunch, fights after school,
I
this,
think there is a benefit to it.
you know
I
what, that thing that you said about people watch their mouths because
Mhm.
they want to keep their teeth.
Yeah.
It's not right, but it is effective.
And here's the thing, I don't think we're ever going to have a society that is all right. I don't think human nature will ever allow it. And honestly, I think maybe it's better to let that bit of uncivilized rage out and let people, I hate to say, get knocked around a bit, because it's like I don't want to be misconstrued.
Well,
And
there's ways of expressing that without physically harming another person,
yeah.
right? And I think that the problem is that zero tolerance policies, because yeah, like I went to school, a kid got knifed, right? A kid got
Now that's
knifed
excessive.
in the school, and it was a rough school. That's why I say it's not right, but it was effective.
Yeah.
And you did spend a lot of time afraid for your physical safety, and kids don't learn well in those environments. But what the zero tolerance policies did was they took away that and didn't replace it with everything, and brought in this bullshit of you're all friends here.
Oh my God. I hate, okay.
Yeah, you're just not.
So, like, okay, here's the thing. There is, so in Encanto, there's this scene where it's like, oh, if you want to fix things, you have to hug your sister.
Oh yeah, but that was wrong. The whole audience is like,
Yeah.
that, yeah.
But it made me realize we have this thing where it's like, especially parents with their siblings, there'll be a fight, they'll talk about it. It's like, okay, hug it out. Well, a hug releases chemicals in your brain.
Yeah.
And it is a bit of a bonding chemical. And so it's going to make you feel better. You are lit drugging the problem.
Yeah, people shouldn't be forced to do anything physical with anybody else. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's an issue with people on the autism spectrum, Like
Yeah.
autistic people are forced to hug people, and it's traumatizing for
Yeah.
some people.
And it's just, oh, hug your sister and move past it and everything will be fine. You're creating these conflicting chemicals in the brain. And I can't imagine what that does to the thought process for
And
kids, especially who don't understand, where it's like you're mixing this anger with this bizarre bonding. That can't be great for
no,
relationships later
it's
in life.
it's codependent, and it
Exactly.
encourages passive aggression, right? It there are some wings of my family that drive me absolutely crazy because they are conflict averse doesn't even cover it.
Mm-hmm.
It's this it's this fawning over abusers and trying to just make it go away by appeasing the problem instead of going, no, you're the problem, get out, you don't do this here. If you're gonna be in my house, you're gonna respect my rules.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's it doesn't make people feel safe when a bully is able to run rampant in an environment.
Yeah. And even going back to the Vikings, like I said, a woman could divorce her husband if
Yeah.
he struck her.
Yeah.
And also, and there have been a few other cultures that had this, but like if you struck her, there was a very strong possibility her father and her brothers were going to come and they were going to strike you back.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. There were consequences for history wasn't Game of Thrones,
No.
right? There were consequences. And I mean, I've been rewatching the original Game of Thrones to see if my memory of it was the same or whether I was being too hard on House of the Dragon. And um Cersei Lannister is, I mean, Lena Headey's performance is wonderful with the boiling, simmering rage she
Mm-hmm.
brings to the part, but it's so disappointing that they just dismiss all of that as, well, she went crazy. She's just a bad person. And then the rage that Emilia Clarke brings to Daenerys is right from the beginning. And this is why I don't understand why people didn't see the quote unquote heel turn coming.
Mm-hmm.
Right from the beginning, Daenerys has this wild-eyed 1,000-yard stare.
You
And
know,
she doesn't just emancipate cities, she murders slavers.
mm-hmm.
She's angry, like
And
she's the mother of dragons.
yeah, and people try to make the argument, oh, well, it's bad people. I don't care if you're willing to do something to a bad person. Well, eventually you're going to find a way to rationalize why anyone is bad.
Well, and they showed that just killing all the new slavers show up,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the fact that they play with the idea of justice, and I didn't think this got enough time in the show because of all the tits ass violence, dragons, red weddings, so on and so forth. But the competing theories of justice coming from Daenerys, who is a victim of profound abuse,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what informs her perspective and her actions. But she's also in mourning. She had this very complicated relationship with Khal Drogo in the show. I mean, in the books, it's different, but you know, she starts off as a victim who you could argue falls in love with her captor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she has this very complicated relationship with him, and then men keep trying to treat her as this trophy bride in different places, and the dialogues between her and Ser Jorah, Ian Glenn, who's a repentant slaver who barely escaped execution at the hands of Ned Stark for selling slaves.
Mm-hmm.
He has this sort of regretful idea of how the world works. And of course, he counsels her. She doesn't tend to listen. But the dialogues are interesting because he's saying, look, you just can't uproot these systems. You have to replace it with something. And I think the reason that so many people are so angry right now is because so many things have been removed from social structures without anything to replace them, right? Everything's anti this, anti that, you know?
I look at it sometimes and I think about, okay, how do how do we make things better? Like I said, I don't think we're ever going to have a perfect society, but I look at it and think, how do you make things better? And it's like, well, you can't fix just one thing. It's all so interwoven. And, and you, especially, you talked about the propaganda from the 50s and coming
Yeah.
back from the war and all these things that have culminated.
Culminated, yeah.
Thank you. Have culminated in this situation we're in. And no one understands how we got here because almost no one is aware of all the things that led us to where we are now. And
Yeah.
like I said, you can't fix one thing. The only thing you can do is honestly what you're doing, which is helping people one-on-one.
And we're trying, I mean, we're expanding into small groups and
Of
then
course.
workshops and things like it. It's been very, very instructive. Like I will say the stuff I've been doing through It's Not Therapy and the bubbles and the one-on-ones and all that stuff. It's been more useful than any research I
Mm-hmm.
could possibly read, because research gives you the numbers, right?
Yeah.
We know people are angry. We know people are pent up. We know people are lonely. We know people are depressed, but we don't know why. And talking to people, and obviously, again, individual mileage may vary, right? But I just find this ongoing thing. You've got the feminists blaming the patriarchy, but they're really blaming men,
Yeah.
and then you've got the manosphere blaming women, and then you've got different racial groups blaming each other, and then you've got, well, you can't just be not racist, you have to be anti-racist, and you have to be anti-groomer, and you have to be anti this and anti that, and it's all what you oppose.
Yeah.
And what I've found is that people just want environments that they can go to where there are rules that they understand and the rules are enforced fairly. They're given warnings. They don't have to be worried that they're going to be ostracized in a second,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And the interesting thing is, it's not just their own direct experiences for this. There are a lot of people who are vicariously traumatized from the sheer amount of aggression that's out there. And Gen Z is now getting the treatment the millennials got when they were in their 20s of, oh, they're
Mm-hmm.
fragile and there isn't enough resilience and snowflakes and all that stuff. But
The one thing that pisses me off a bit whenever I see older people complaining about, oh, well, this generation didn't do this. And I especially see it on Facebook. It's like, we were the last generation who died and did this and that. And it's like, okay, these people you're complaining about, they're your kids.
yeah, well, they're the
So if,
grandkids at this point. Yeah.
well, true, but I've one person in particular, I've seen it pop up on my Facebook timeline. I know her. She's someone I used
Oh,
to work
oh, oh,
with.
okay, okay.
And so her kids are younger than me.
Oh,
And I'm like, I'm sorry, whose fault is that?
well, yeah, you raised them.
Exactly. Now, this woman in particular, she was a single mother, so I know that, and that's one reason why I feel like we glorify single motherhood a bit too
Well,
much.
that it's one of those things where it's, you know, there are real myths around what it means to be a single mother. I mean, what's her name? Somebody like Sheryl Sandberg, for instance, not the same kind of single mother as a poor woman,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Exactly.
single motherhood isn't Murphy Brown all the time, but it's also not, I mean, the after school special stereotype, right? There are good single mothers, there are not good single mothers, and we really neglect the role of greater community in youth development.
Oh God, we are missing that so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Well, we're exterminating it.
Yeah.
It's so much focus on parental control right now that mentorship, which is incredibly important, is getting snuffed out. I had a conversation earlier with a guy who didn't go into elementary school teaching because the whole, oh, any guy that wants to work with children must be a pervert
Pretty
thing.
much, yeah.
And it's like, good God, I thought about that. And like a third of my elementary school teachers were men.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't strange. Now, apparently, it's more common in urban areas. And I was in gifted as well. But my grade 6 teacher was ex-military, and people did not, he was kind of scary, but he was fair, and
Mm-hmm.
people did not screw around. And he was the guy
That's the
that let us
one.
play.
Yeah, that's the one who said, "Do you actually like this D&D
Yeah.
stuff?" Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was the guy that let us play Dungeons and Dragons for creative writing. Brilliant, brilliant move as a teacher. But like, he was hardcore. And I mean, that's just so stupid, right? The idea that somebody who wants to work with youth, there's this assumption that it's negative, and that to me is the same issue that we've gotten into. Everything has been stunted, everything has been packed down, everything has been about what you don't do and aren't supposed to do. It's this suppression that they're packaging as stoicism, and stoicism was never about suppression of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Stoicism was always putting it in perspective, focusing on what you can control and the paradox of control.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, with the, I'm going to say it, fetishization of education, there was this idea that the path of your life is more in your control than it actually is. You know, you can go to a great school and get great grades and still not, you're not going to end up destitute,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not going to end up in this hotshot job with, you're going to probably be comfortable.
Well, I mean, with student loans in the US, you just
Yeah.
might end up destitute.
Well, I know some guys, they work for major companies, they're MBAs, and up until a few years ago, they still had roommates because of student debt.
Yeah.
And it's just, I understand why, because they used to, when I was in school, it used to be, well, the boomers aren't retiring and we're having the silver wave. So you guys are going to get out of school and there's going to be no jobs for you. Like, they'd actually tell us that in class, which was not
Yay.
great for our mental health, but at least it set accurate expectations, because that's exactly what happened, right? We did not go into it expecting anything but what we got. And as much as there were offset challenges there, I think in a way that's better than being told, if you stay in school and get good grades and get a good degree and go into these particular fields, you will have a job and you will have money and you will have a good life. And of course, then they produce, I mean, when I was in school, it was too many lawyers and too many teachers.
Yeah.
Of course, now we've got a teacher shortage,
Mm.
right? But they were churning out so many teachers when I was in school that there wasn't space for them. Teachers were having trouble finding work. Lawyers were having trouble finding work. And then, the next bubble was computer scientists. There were too many computer scientists, so good coders ended up working tech support. There's no guarantees in life. And unfortunately, too many people have been raised with this idea of destiny. And when it doesn't happen, they get bitter and they get angry, but they've been taught to believe that anger is bad and evil. And so they don't feel it. And so they don't work through it. And they end up doing things that I watch people just descend into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not for lack of people trying to intervene, but they're just so in the shit that they cannot stop. And you see it, you see the anger, and they'll deny they're angry. But it's very clear from so many things. They're angry, they're paranoid, they're afraid. And I think that the combination between anger and fear is something that's not discussed enough.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's that cycle, right? You spend so much time in fear, every so often you get angry, you try to rebel, you're smacked down, you go back to living in fear. It just bubbles up, right? But when anger is punished, and this is true of people being treated for PTSD, it's true of, autistic meltdowns, it's true for people who get frustrated with ADHD, it's true for people coming out of major depression. There is an anger phase. Grief has an anger phase. And if people are punished for that anger phase, it can cause really deep, lasting damage in them. And I see a lot of people walking around, walking wounded. Like, they're damaged, they're in denial, they're not, and they don't have to be that way, right? You can treat this stuff. You can create a new normal that's better than the old normal. It's never going to go back. This idea that, oh, you'll get better. No, you're going to get different. You're never going to go back to the way you were. That's not how the human psyche works.